Guten Abend. Ich freue mich sehr, Sie hier zu sehen. 12 Jahre nachdem ich Jennifer Egan mit A Visit of the Goon Squad vorgestellt habe, kann ich sie jetzt vorstellen mit dem Candy House. Darauf freue ich mich sehr. Und gesprochen wird die Übersetzung von Henning Arendt von Nina West. Der Abend ist wie folgt. Ich beginne mit einer Einführung, 5-6 Minuten lang. Unmittelbar, mehr oder weniger unmittelbar danach gibt es die erste Lesung. Wir beginnen aber mit der deutschen Lesung, weil Nina den Beginn des Romans liest. Und das Stückchen, was Jennifer sich ausgesucht hat, bezieht sich auf diesen ersten Teil, also liest sie als zweite. Dann gibt es ein Gespräch, dann gibt es noch eine etwas längere Lesung, dann gibt es noch ein Gespräch, dann gibt es noch eine Lesung. Sie kennen das alles. Danken will ich auch noch Gyda, Thurow und Milena Adam, die sitzen irgendwo im Hintergrund in einer Kabine und flüstern Ihnen ins Ohr, sofern Sie das gewünscht haben. Zur Einführung. Würde ich mich trauen, würde ich es machen. Hier, auf der Bühne, direkt vor Ihnen. Wie man es macht? Die Anweisung dazu findet sich im Buch, ziemlich genau in der Mitte. Da heißt es, der Urschrei ist die menschliche Entsprechung einer Explosion. Ein Laut, in dem sich Kreischen, Brüllen und Heulen mischt. Dieser Schrei muss mit verzerrter Miene und wilden Bewegungen einhergehen, die Irrsinn und Raserei nahelegen. Der Urschrei muss dich in ein Ungeheuer verwandeln. Aber wie gesagt, ich traue mich nicht. Alfred dagegen, der kann das. Der schreit in aller Öffentlichkeit, im Zug der Linie L, auf dem Times Square, im Whole Foods, im Whitneys. Die meisten Menschen sind nicht sie selbst, sagt Alfred. Sie mimen sich nur. Sie spielen immerzu irgendwelche Rollen und er hält das nicht länger aus. Er will echte, unverfälschte Reaktionen, keinen gekünstelten Quatsch. Er will Authentizität. Und wenn er dieses Wort ausspricht, dann ist das, als würde eine uralte, heilige Schriftrolle entfaltet. Also heult er, im Bus zum Beispiel, heult wie ein Wolf, starrt aber nicht den Mond an, sondern die Fahrgäste, sieht ihre Panik, das Entsetzen, einen Fluchtimpuls, der an die Hysterie von Passagieren in einem abstürzenden Flugzeug erinnert. Solch extreme Reaktionen sind für Alfred nicht nur eine Freude, sie sind ein Genuss, nein, eine Offenbarung. Jennifer Egan wurde in Chicago geboren und zog mit 7 Jahren nach San Francisco, wo ihre Mutter die Kay Kimpton Art Gallery eröffnete. Ihr irischstämmiger Großvater war seinerzeit Polizeichef von Chicago und Bodyguard von Präsident Truman. Der andere Großvater Facharzt für Orthopädie. Ihm verdankte sie ihren ersten Berufswunsch, Ärztin, sowie ein gewisses Interesse an Krankheiten und Knochen, das zum zweiten Berufswunsch, Archäologin, führte, der ihr allerdings durch ein Praktikum bei einer Ausgrabung in Campsville, Illinois, gründlich ausgetrieben wurde. Auf dem Höhepunkt der Hippie-Bewegung jobbte Jennifer Egan im Café Kiss My Sweet, besuchte die Lowell High School, studierte Englisch an der University of Pennsylvania sowie am St. John's College in Cambridge und bekam von ihrem damaligen Lover, einem gewissen Steve Jobs, einen der ersten Macintoshes geschenkt. Als Journalistin schreibt sie für das New York Times Magazine und veröffentlichte 1993 ihr erstes Buch, eine Kurzgeschichtensammlung. Auf Emerald City folgte Die Farbe der Erinnerung, ein mit Cameron Diaz verfilmter Roman. Für A Visit from the Goon Squad, zu Deutsch Der größere Teil der Welt, erhielt sie unter anderem den Pulitzer Prize. Candy House ist ihr 7. Roman, ein Geschwisterroman zu Der größere Teil der Welt. Und wieder sind es verflochtene, aber unabhängige Kurzgeschichten. Jedes Kapitel wird von einer neuen Stimme erzählt. Stimmen, die zu einem symphonischen Ganzen zusammengeführt werden. Der Zeitrahmen ist weit gesteckt. Eine Erzählung spielt 1965 im kalifornischen Redwood Park, eine andere im Jahre 2035. Diesmal geht es nicht um die Musikindustrie, sondern um den Reiz neuer Technologien. Candy House beginnt mit Bix Boughton, der nachts durch Manhattan spaziert, verkleidet, weil ihn sonst jeder erkennt. In Der größere Teil der Welt war er ein von Computern besessener Nerd, der in einer verqualmten WG am Bildschirm hockte und das Internet vorhersah. Inzwischen ist er der Tech-Mogul, Gründer von Mandala, einem sozialen Netzwerk, das ähnlich wie Facebook unsere Art, online miteinander zu kommunizieren, grundsätzlich verändert hat und ebenfalls ähnlich wie Facebook eigentlich nicht mehr so ganz cool ist. Deshalb geht Bix Boughton nachts in Manhattan spazieren. Ihn treibt die nächste Entwicklung um, ein externer Erinnerungsspeicher, genannt Besitze dein Unbewusstes. Wer seine Daten anonymisiert ins kollektive Unbewusste einspeist, bekommt dafür unbegrenzten Zugriff auf die Erinnerungen anderer, das ganze Leben gespeichert in einem Cube. Was natürlich gleich Renegaten auf den Plan ruft, jene, die sich dem Kollektivbewusstsein verweigern, durch Proxys eine Internetpräsenz vortäuschen und sich vor den Zählenden in der Anonymität verstecken. Implantierte Asseln beeinflussen das Denken, Data Miner übertragen menschliches Verhalten in Formeln. Ein Kapitel wird nur in E-Mails erzählt, ein anderes in Form von Befehlen, die eine ferngesteuerte, mit subkutaner Elektronik ausgestattete Geheimagentin innerlich sendet und empfängt. Kapitel um Kapitel wird ein weltweites und mehrere Generationen überspannendes Netz gewoben, in dem sich die Leser verfangen, die schon lange nicht mehr wissen, was noch authentisch ist im Zeitalter digital vermittelter Erfahrung. Was ist denn Fake, was real? Kann wirklich nur der Urschrei noch echte Reaktionen hervorrufen? Ist Erinnerung noch Erinnerung, wenn sie jederzeit unverändert abgerufen werden kann? Junkies, Verlorene, Abgestürzte und nie Aufgestiegene erzählen ihre Geschichten in Candy House. Zentrale Figuren aus Der größere Teil der Welt tauchen am Rande wieder auf. Ihre Kinder rücken in den Vordergrund. Und wie wir alle spüren sie den Reiz der neuen Technologien, knabbern am Lebkuchenhaus, am Candy House und erliegen seinem Zauber. Soweit die Einführung. Eine Frage, bevor wir zur Lesung kommen. There are many creative writing schools. Just one question before the reading. Many creative writing schools who teach you should only write about what you know. That's something you don't do, is it?
No, that's the opposite of what I do. But I also am wondering, does anyone really say that? I don't know.
Maybe it's a rumor.
No, I mean, for me, the joy of writing, as with reading, is that of discovery and surprise. So the first question I always have when I begin is, what am I going to find out? What is the adventure this is going to be? And if I sense what I'm doing veering into my familiar world, it feels very boring to me. So for example, I find myself often writing from a male point of view. That almost comes more easily because it immediately creates a separation between me and the character.
It's never only just one question. So when you get to something autobiographical, you feel bored, you stop writing about it?
If I feel like it's becoming familiar, it's almost the same feeling that I have when I feel my language becoming familiar. Yeah. The whole point of fiction for me is to find the unfamiliar, to find the idea or the possibility that I haven't thought of. So if familiar language is cliche, and for me, writing in a way that seems to be part of my own life feels dull in the same way that a cliche is dull.
When Nicholas Shakespeare was a young writer writing his first novel, he became a visit from friend Bruce Chatwin, who was famous that time, still is. And he said, let me give you, young writer, an advice. Before you start a novel, take a whiteboard, write down where it begins, where it happens what, how it ends. Nicholas did, and he became a writer. But that's something you wouldn't ever do, would you?
Not before I start. I might do it after I have a first draft, but the first draft is very improvisational. So my goal there is to discover material that feels alive. And so I tend to write fiction by hand, and I write it, and my handwriting is terrible, which is actually a good thing until it's time to type it. So I write 5 or 6 pages in longhand, and I don't read it over until the next day, just to re-enter the flow and keep going. So of course, a lot of what I come up with is terrible. I mean, there are good days and bad days. Some of it doesn't make sense. I forget what happened before, and I do different things. But that's what brings me the most interesting possibilities. Then I make outlines and charts, and not charts, but outlines, revision outlines. But I tend to revise by hand on hard copies, so that again, I have access to what I think of as my unconscious, which knows more than I do and has better ideas than I do.
How indecipherable her language is, her writing is, you can see on her website. If you click on the novel, you see, and I couldn't read a word of it, but it's impressive. Now, really the last question. Why a sibling novel? Why not a sequel?
Well, neither of these books are in chronological order, so to call it a sequel seems really out of keeping with the spirit of these books, which are not organized by chronology. A sequel implies that it comes next. There's no difference in my mind between reading Goon Squad first or Candy House first. The earliest material in time in the 2 books is actually in Candy House. We go back further in time. So it just feels like not an accurate description of the relationship.
Now we start with the reading, please.
Der Zauber des Vertrauten. Weißt du, wonach ich mich sehne? Fragte Bix, während er wie üblich vor dem Schlafengehen neben dem Bett Schultern und Wirbelsäule dehnte. Einfach nur zu plaudern. Lizzie begegnete seinem Blick über die dunklen Locken Gregorys, ihres Jüngsten, hinweg, den sie gerade stillte. Ich höre, murmelte sie. Es ist, er holte tief Luft, ich weiß auch nicht, heikel. Lizzie schnellte in die Senkrechte und Bix begriff, dass sie alarmiert war. Der abgerutschte Gregory quakte, Mama, ich komme nicht mehr ran. Er war gerade 3 geworden. Der Junge muss abgestillt werden, brummte Bix. Nein, entgegnete Gregory und sah Bix trotzig an. Das will ich nicht. Lizzie ließ sich von Gregorys Zerren erweichen und legte sich wieder hin. Bix fragte sich, ob das jüngste ihrer 4 Kinder seine Kleinkindphase mit Unterstützung der Mutter bis ins Erwachsenendasein ausdehnen würde. Er legte sich neben die beiden und sah Lizzie beklommen in die Augen. »Was ist denn los, Liebster?« flüsterte sie. »Ach, nichts«, log er, denn was ihn bedrückte, ging zu tief, war zu vielgestaltig für eine Erklärung. Er schob eine Tatsache hinterher. »Ich muss ständig an die East 7th Street denken, an die Gespräche.« »Immer noch?« sagte sie leise. »Immer noch.« »Aber warum denn?« Bix wusste auch nicht, warum, zumal er immer nur mit halbem Ohr zugehört hatte, wenn Lizzie und ihre Clique, eingehüllt in eine Cumuluswolke aus Marihuana-Qualm, in der East 7th Street so laut gequatscht hatten wie verirrte Wanderer in einem nebligen Tal. Was unterscheidet die Liebe von der Lust? Gibt es das Böse? Bix hatte seine Dissertation halb fertig, als er mit Lizzie zusammengezogen war. Und derlei Gespräche hatte er schon in der Highschool und während der ersten Jahre an der Penn geführt. Seine gegenwärtige Nostalgie entsprang dem, was er empfunden hatte, während er, enthoben an seiner Spark Station sitzend, die durch ein Modem mit dem Viola World Wide Web verbunden war, Lizzie und ihrer Clique gelauscht hatte. Die heimliche und berauschende Gewissheit, dass die Welt, die diese Studierenden im Jahr 1992 so eifrig zu verstehen suchten, bald obsolet wäre. Gregory saugte, Lizzie dämmerte. »Ginge das?« drängte Bix. »Jetzt ein solches Gespräch zu führen?« »Jetzt?« Sie wirkte ausgelaugt, wurde vor seinen Augen ausgesaugt. Bix wusste, dass sie um 6 Uhr aufstehen würde, um die Kinder zu versorgen, während er meditierte und anschließend seine Anrufe nach Asien tätigte. Er war auf einmal verzweifelt. Mit wem konnte er so entspannt, offen und studentisch reden wie damals am College? Jede Person, die beim Mandala arbeitete, würde sich irgendwie bemühen, ihm entgegenzukommen. Jede Person, die nicht beim Mandala arbeitete, würde meinen, er verfolge heimliche Absichten oder glauben, es wäre ein Test, dessen Belohnung in einer Anstellung beim Mandala bestünde. Seine Eltern, Schwestern. Er hatte, ganz gleich wie sehr er sie liebte, nie solche Gespräche mit ihnen gehabt. Sobald Lizzie und Gregory tief und fest schliefen, trug Biggs seinen Sohn durch den Flur zu dessen Kinderbett. Er beschloss, sich wieder anzuziehen und rauszugehen. Es war schon nach 11. Es verstieß gegen die Sicherheitsregularien des Vorstands, allein durch New York zu laufen, egal zu welcher Stunde, zumal nach Anbruch der Dunkelheit. Und deshalb verzichtete er auf seine Markenzeichen, den just abgelegten, dekonstruierten Zoot-Suit, inspiriert von den Ska-Bands, die er zu Highschool-Zeiten vergöttert hatte, und den ledernen Trilby, den er seit 15 Jahren, seit seinem Abgang von der NYU trug, weil er sich nach dem Abschneiden seiner Dreadlocks sonderbar nackt gefühlt hatte. Er grub im Kleiderschrank eine Militärjacke mit Tarnmuster und ein altes Paar Stiefel aus und trat ohne Kopfbedeckung in das nächtliche Chelsea, der kalten Luft trotzend, die über seine Kopfhaut strich. Oben war er kahl geworden. Er hatte den Impuls, seinen Hut doch noch zu holen und wollte in die Kamera winken, damit die Wachleute ihn wieder einließen, als ihm ein Straßenhändler auffiel, der an der Ecke der 7th Avenue stand. Biggs durchquerte die 21st Street, bis er dort angelangt war, setzte probehalber eine Beanie aus schwarzer Wolle auf und betrachtete sich in einem kleinen, runden Spiegel auf der Seite des Standes. Mit der Beanie sah er stinknormal aus, fand er. Der Verkäufer nahm den 5-Dollar-Schein entgegen, wie bei allen Kunden, und der Kauf erfüllte Biggs Herz mit spitzbübischer Freude. Inzwischen musste er damit rechnen, überall erkannt zu werden. Diese Anonymität war ein ganz neues Gefühl. Früher Oktober, die Kälte war schneidend. Biggs folgte der 7th Avenue in Richtung Uptown und plante, nach ein paar Blocks umzukehren. Doch es tat gut, bei Dunkelheit zu gehen. Es versetzte ihn in seine Zeit in der East 7th Street zurück. Damals, in ihren Anfangsjahren, waren Lizzies Eltern gelegentlich aus San Antonio zu Besuch gekommen. Sie glaubten, ihre Tochter würde das Apartment mit ihrer Freundin Sasha teilen, auch eine NYU-Anfängerin. Eine Täuschung, an der diese mitwirkte, indem sie an dem Abend zu Beginn des Wintersemesters, als Lizzies Eltern das Apartment besichtigten, im Badezimmer die Wäsche wusch. Lizzie entstammte einer Welt, die Schwarze nicht wahrnahm, es sei denn, sie arbeiteten als Diener oder Caddies im Country Club der Eltern. Ihre Furcht vor dem elterlichen Entsetzen bei der Entdeckung, dass sie mit ihrem schwarzen Freund zusammenlebte, war so groß, dass Biggs während der ersten Besuche aus dem Bett verbannt wurde, obwohl die Alten in einem Hotel in Midtown wohnten. Aber egal, sie hätten es gewittert. Also war Biggs durch die Straßen gelatscht und manchmal, unter dem Vorwand, eine Nachtschicht einzulegen, im Ingenieurslabor eingepennt. Dieses Umherirren hatte sich seinem Körper eingeprägt, als zähes Gebot, trotz Missmut und Erschöpfung weiterzugehen. Wenn er daran dachte, mitgespielt zu haben, fühlte er sich mies. Obwohl die ausgleichende Gerechtigkeit, wie er fand, darin bestand, dass sich Lizzie nun um jeden Aspekt ihres häuslichen Daseins kümmerte, damit er nach Lust und Laune arbeiten und reisen konnte. All das Gute, das ihm seither widerfahren war, konnte man durchaus als Entschädigung für seine damaligen Wanderungen auffassen. Dennoch, warum? War der Sex wirklich so gut? Nun ja, hatte er sich dem arkanen Denken seiner weißen Freundin ohne Protest gefügt, weil sein Selbstwertgefühl so gering gewesen war? Hatte es ihm gefallen, ihr verbotenes Geheimnis zu sein? Nein, nichts von alledem. Die Ursache für seine Langmütigkeit und Geduld hatte im Zauber der Vision bestanden, die er während seiner quälenden Exilnächte mit hypnotischer Klarheit vor Augen gehabt hatte. Lizzie und ihre Clique wussten 1992 nicht einmal ansatzweise, was das Internet war. Aber Biggs spürte die Vibrationen, mit denen die Fäden eines alles verbindenden, unsichtbaren Netzes die vertraute Welt zu durchziehen begannen, als wären es immer weiter um sich greifende Risse in einer Windschutzscheibe. Das Leben, wie sie es kannten, würde bald in Scherben gehen und hinweggefegt werden. Und dann würden alle gemeinsam in eine neue metaphysische Sphäre emporsteigen. Biggs hatte dabei stets an die Gemälde des jüngsten Gerichts gedacht, die er als Reproduktionen gesammelt hatte. Allerdings ohne die Hölle, denn die Schwarzen, so glaubte er, würden in einer körperlosen Sphäre von dem Hass erlöst werden, der sie in der physischen Welt behinderte und hemmte. Sie könnten sich in dieser Sphäre nach Belieben versammeln und bewegen, ohne dem Druck von Typen wie Lizzys Eltern ausgesetzt zu sein. Gesichtslosen Texanern, die etwas gegen ihn hatten, ohne von seiner Existenz zu wissen. Der Begriff soziale Medien als Bezeichnung des Geschäftsmodells von Mandala sollte erst 10 Jahre später geprägt werden. Aber Biggs hatte das Konzept schon lange vor der Umsetzung im Kopf. Gott sei Dank hatte er seine utopische Fantasie damals für sich behalten. Heute, im Jahr 2010, kam sie ihm fast komisch naiv vor. Aber ihre grundlegende Struktur hatte sich als tragfähig erwiesen, sowohl in globaler als auch in individueller Hinsicht. 1996 hatten Lizzys Eltern, zugeknöpft, ihrer Hochzeit im Tompkins Square Park beigewohnt, wenn auch nicht zugeknöpfter als Biggs Eltern, in deren Augen Magier, Jongleure oder wildes Fiedeln nicht zu einer anständigen Eheschließung passten. Mit den Geburten der Kinder entspannten sich alle. Lizzys Vater war im letzten Jahr gestorben. Und seither hatte Biggs Schwiegermutter die Angewohnheit entwickelt, ihn anzurufen, wenn Lizzy bereits schlief, um über die Familie zu reden. Werde Richard, ihr Ältester, reiten lernen? Gingen die Mädchen gerne in Broadway-Musicals? Wenn seine Schwiegermutter leibhaftig anwesend war, empfand Biggs ihren Texas-Slang als schwere Prüfung. Aber wenn ihre Stimme am späten Abend im Telefon ertönte, sorgte das, wie er sich eingestehen musste, für eine leise Befriedigung. Jedes Wort, das sie im Äther wechselten, rief ihm ins Bewusstsein, dass er recht gehabt hatte. Eines Morgens war es dann schlagartig vorbei mit den Gesprächen in der East 7th Street. Nach einer durchgefeierten Nacht gingen 2 besonders enge Freunde Lizzys im East River schwimmen und einer wurde von der Strömung mitgerissen und ertrank. Damals waren Lizzys Eltern zu Besuch gewesen, mit der Folge, dass Biggs um ein Haar in diese Tragödie verwickelt worden wäre. In den frühen Morgenstunden war er Rob und Thru im East Village begegnet. Sie hatten Ecstasy genommen und waren dann bei Sonnenaufgang zu dritt der Überführung zum Fluss gefolgt. Biggs war schon auf dem Heimweg gewesen, als die 2 weiter unten am Ufer spontan beschlossen hatten, ins Wasser zu gehen. Obwohl er im Rahmen der polizeilichen Ermittlungen jedes Detail wiederholt hatte, waren seine Erinnerungen verblasst. Es war immerhin 17 Jahre her. Er hatte die beiden Jungs kaum noch vor Augen. Er bog nach links auf den Broadway ab und ging bis zur 110th Street. Sein erster Spaziergang dieser Art, seit er vor 10 Jahren berühmt geworden war. Er hatte nie viel Zeit im Viertel rund um die Columbia University verbracht, fand die hügeligen Straßen und prachtvollen Vorkriegs-Apartmenthäuser aber reizvoll. Als er zu einem der erhellten Fenster aufsah, konnte er regelrecht hören, wie dahinter hochpotenzierte Ideen köchelten. Auf dem Weg zur U-Bahn, noch eine Premiere nach 10 Jahren, blieb er vor einem Laternenpfahl stehen, gefiedert mit Zetteln mit Angeboten von gebrauchten Möbeln oder der Bitte um Hilfe bei der Suche nach vermissten Haustieren. Ein gedrucktes Plakat fiel ihm ins Auge. Ein Vortrag der Anthropologin Miranda Klein auf dem Campusgelände. Biggs war mit Miranda Kleins Arbeit umfassend vertraut und sie mit der seinen. 1 Jahr nach der Gründung von Mandala war ihm ihr Buch Muster des Vertrauten in die Hände gefallen. Die darin formulierten Ideen waren in seinem Geist explodiert wie die Tinte eines Kalmars und hatten ihn sehr reich gemacht. Die Tatsache, dass KM, wie Klein in seiner Welt liebevoll tituliert wurde, den Nutzen, den Biggs und seinesgleichen aus ihren Theorien zogen, missbilligte, hatte die Faszination, die sie auf ihn ausübte, nur gesteigert. Man hatte einen handschriftlichen Flyer an das Plakat getackert. Lasst uns reden. Fachübergreifende, große Fragen in verständlicher Sprache. 3 Wochen nach Kleins Vortrag sollte eine Diskussionsrunde stattfinden. Ein Zufall, der Biggs Herz höher schlagen ließ. Er fotografierte das Plakat, riss danach aus Jux einen der Papierstreifen des Lasst uns reden Flyers ab und steckte ihn ein, während er sich darüber wunderte, dass in dieser neuen, von ihm mitgestalteten Welt bis heute Zettel an Laternenpfähle geheftet wurden.
Herzlichen Dank, Dina West. Die Übersetzung, das sei gern noch einmal gesagt, von Henning Ahrens. Die Szene, auf die sie zuletzt angespielt hat, der Tod im East End River, der wurde uns schon einmal im A Visit from the Goon Squad geschildert aus der Perspektive des ertrinkenden Rob. Und wir kommen auch jetzt in diesem Stück noch einmal auf diese Szene zurück. You're going to read again the scene of the drowning.
Sure. So we're hearing from the point of view of a man named Thurow, who was also present at the drowning. Wait, one thing. Just starting to use these. Works a lot better when I do. Bix Boughton was the last person to see Rob and me before our East River swim. He got in touch with me out of the blue in 2016 when Own Your Unconscious was blowing up. Bix wrote that it was his memory of Rob and that morning and those years, his difficulty remembering them, that first spurred him to try to mass produce a memory externalization device. It filled me with relief to know that Bix, whom I hadn't seen since NYU and who'd become, in the interim, a tech demigod on a first-name basis with the world, was still moved by Rob's death. Not long after Bix got back in touch, Sasha and I went to New York to visit him and Lizzie. The four of us watched Bix's memory of April 6th, 1993, on separate headsets. Bix started rolling as we arrived at the East River at sunrise. "Gentlemen, good morning," came Bix's voice, and there were Rob and me through Bix's eyes, two shaggy-haired 19-year-olds. Kids was my first thought. As a parent, I saw Rob with aching clarity through the screen of his reddish stubble, his exhaustion and worry, an edgy eagerness to please that his irony couldn't conceal. At one point, he lifted up his arms in a stretch, and I caught the old football bulk, the ridges of pink scar tissue inside his wrists. And then there was the part I'd failed, or maybe refused, to see at the time, a tenderness when Rob looked at me, a trusting admiration that was obviously love. I wished fleetingly that Bix hadn't silenced the thought and feeling portion of his consciousness. I wanted to know if he'd seen it. Would Bix have recognized the fumbling proposition Rob made to me some 20 minutes later as inevitable? But the real torture was watching my 19-year-old self, cocky and full of hope, unaware that within the hour, I would begin the after portion of my life, in which I would try, endlessly and futilely, to atone. Gentlemen, good morning. We watched the memory again and again. I was clutching Sasha's hand and I felt her weeping. But repetition dulled her response, and at some point, she and Lizzie removed their headsets and took a bottle of wine up to the roof deck. I had to keep watching. There was something I needed to pinpoint in the lull, that last pause before Rob and I waved goodbye and began walking south along the river in the blinding, metallic, early morning sunlight. And then we were out of sight. Bix had turned and was walking toward the 6th Street overpass, heading to his apartment on East 7th Street. Wait, stop. I couldn't keep myself from exhorting him. Turn around, call us back. Stop it, stop it, stop it. I realized I was shouting only when Bix switched off my headset and lifted it gently away.
Thank you very much. Why did you return to that scene? Why is it so important for this novel?
Well, there were a lot of, I mean, it's the nature of books like this, first of all, that are ensemble stories involving a lot of characters, that there's a lot that feels unfinished. The chapter in which we actually witness the drowning from the point of view of the person who drowns, in A Visit from the Goon Squad, was one of the last ones that I wrote. And it felt...
But it's fairly in the middle.
Yes. And it felt like an enormous event to just touch once and walk away from. And I felt a little like that felt unfinished to me because it's so enormous. And yet we just see it the one time, whereas a lot of other things we see from multiple points of view in that book. So I felt moved to, I kept thinking about Rob and his family and what kind of impact it would have on Thru to have basically witnessed this event and to some degree the guilt of maybe having been able to stop it and not having done so. And the other thing is that I knew when I wrote about Bix in Goon Squad, and he appears very briefly, just, he's partied all night with these two guys before they go swimming, and he predicts the results of social media, basically. He says, everyone we've lost will find, or they'll find us. And I thought, I bet Bix invents social media. He goes on to do that. And I sort of knew it in that moment, but of course that's not in Goon Squad. So all of these questions, curiosity, and knowledge about the future of these three people felt worth exploring further.
How do I have to mention this? You started then writing this book immediately after A Visit from the Goon Squad? Did you start then? Or was it something like voices rumoring in your head for years and years, and then you said, okay, I have to pick this up now again?
No, I started it. And actually...
Immediately afterwards?
Yes, and I guess my handwriting is so terrible on the website that you couldn't read the dates at the top, because on the website you can look at the first page of each chapter in Candy House as published. Yeah. And if you hover over the first paragraph, you can go down through the layers of revision to the actual handwritten first draft, and it's dated. And sometimes I wrote things like, I write the number of pages that I wrote that day, and in one case I wrote, yay, because I was happy that I hit my page number. Yes, so the earliest was, the first chapter I wrote was actually not the first chapter of the book, it was Lulu the Spy. And I started that in 2010 on my book tour for A Visit from the Goon Squad. And then what you just read, the Bix chapter, was the second one I worked on. So I wrote probably a couple hundred handwritten pages early on. And Lulu the Spy I published as a novella. I worked a long time on that, yeah. The rest of it I left untyped, so it really felt mysterious. And I took it back out in 2016 and typed it all up. Some of it was unusable, which is always the case with me. And probably even more so in books like this where I'm trying new things formally. And then I kept, I sort of looked at what I had and kept going from there. So there was maybe a 4-year lag, but I had started.
So you have these unfinished stories, and did you have, how should I put it? I once spoke with Ian Rankin, a Scottish crime writer, who told me, I've written a standalone novel with an Inspector Rebus. And when I started my next book, a new standalone, I suddenly realized I can't do it because Inspector Rebus is still talking to me. So now he's published 53 novels about Inspector Rebus. He's still talking to him in his head. Was it the same for you? Voices in your head? Or is it more this concern with unfinished things you have to finish?
I don't really start with voices, actually. I start with times and places. So I start with physical environments and kind of sensory impressions of those environments. So I wouldn't say that I had voices exactly, but I definitely had people I was curious about. In some ways, places I was curious about. So for example, another chapter we're going to hear from tonight is from the 1960s, sort of redwood forests of California, and I felt a longing to write about that kind of environment. So it's a mix of, with a book like this especially, formal experiments I want to try, big abstract ideas that seem rich that I hope I can approach in fiction, characters about whom I know things that I haven't been able to share with the reader, and things I'm just curious to discover. I would say it's a mix of all of that.
And A Visit from the Goon Squad became your most successful novel so far. Biggs is phoning at night with his mother-in-law, and he tells her, "I fear I can't do it again." Did you have the same fears, like you knew you will be writing a sibling novel to the first one? Did you hear his voice, "I can't do it again"?
Well, it's interesting. I had that voice in my head when I was working on Manhattan Beach, the novel, the next novel that I published. And actually, in America, that novel is far more successful than Goon Squad. So that's my big hit.
Okay.
But I definitely felt over-rewarded for Goon Squad. I felt my stock was a little too high, which is always a scary position for an investor to be in. We're experiencing that in the American stock market right now. So I felt that I did get a little freaked out while I was working on Manhattan Beach, thinking, you know, I can't write another good book, and then, you know, that will be a disaster. But I sort of worked through that in working on Manhattan Beach, and by the time I returned to this material, I just basically enjoyed doing it, I have to say.
Okay. Let's talk about fairy tales. I mean, we were in the mood already because you said you got so many rewards for your books. Fairy tales is, I think, the next section we're going to hear starts like a fairy tale. But fairy tale is, of course, the title too. Das Lebkuchenhaus, the German Hänsel and Gretel. We can hear, what is the candy house? What does it stand for?
Well, I would never want it to be that specific. I had a few other titles that were a little too specific and they had to go. Candy House came in as a title pretty late, actually. It was already in the text in a sort of comic context, which is that two daughters of a very famous, successful record producer are trying to figure out how to stop people from using Napster when it came along in '99. And they have a brief thought that if they can do a billboard campaign throughout America and put billboards on highways that say, "Never trust a candy house," people will see these and think, I shouldn't use Napster because I feel like I'm getting this music for free, but it's not really free. Now, that's all pretty silly. They don't end up doing it. But that was how the phrase candy house first appeared in the book. And then at some point in my revisions, I thought, you know, that's actually a rich title in all kinds of ways. It evokes fairy tales, as you say. Fairy tales come up a lot in the book and already were there by the time I was asking these questions. And the thing that I like about the candy house is that on the one hand, it is a scary symbol in the Grimm's tale, of course. There's a witch inside who wants to eat the children. But it also seems very appealing. Like, I love candy, I have a sweet tooth, and it seemed that there was a more benign way to look at it, that it's an appealing temptation, whose costs may not be entirely visible, but they may also not be deadly.
So in a way, it stands for modern technology and the lure and the attraction of modern technologies as such. But I must admit, when I see a candy house in a shop for Christmas times, I've completely forgotten that a candy house is a trap.
I love candy. I mean, I think candy's beautiful, actually. If you think about hard candy, I've made candy houses.
Wow, okay.
So I agree. That's exactly, if it only were a warning, if that were our only association with that phrase, I would never have wanted to use it. That's a downer of a title. I'm not interested in warning people about anything or telling people what to think. my goal is always to raise questions and, above all, to write something that is fun. So I thought candy houses are kind of fun.
And when you're tempted to eat from the candy house, you have this craving for something sweet. In the passage we just heard, it's Bix saying, I have this craving. And I felt when I read this sentence, it's like this could be the motto of the whole book, I have this craving. Because it's the craving for, I use it in my introduction with a screaming boy. He is craving for something real, something unaltered. And that's something raw that we don't get with media. And it seems to work the opposite way. The more I crave for something real and raw, the more I get ersatz, not the real thing.
It's one of those ironies at the heart of media culture, I think, that mediated experience feels mediated, because it is, and that engenders in us a craving for authenticity, and then media culture tries to satisfy that craving, but it's still mediated. So we remain in this kind of state of hunger, which is extremely profitable to all of the companies who offer us satisfactions for their own profit.
And now Bix invents something that he calls own your subconscious, unconscious. What is that?
That is a machine that allows you to externalize the whole of your consciousness, all of your memories beginning at birth. And you can look at them then from your present day point of view. You essentially have access to all of the memories that you remember, and also the many more that you don't remember. And the spark for all of this for Bix was the fact that he can't remember anything about the morning of the drowning, almost nothing. He's a man who has made social life completely searchable. You can find anyone as long as you know their name, but he can't find his own memories. His memory is not searchable. So this is what prompts the invention. So you can externalize your consciousness, and that is a personal product that no one else has to ever see. But if you want to, and it's purely voluntary, you can share all or part of your consciousness to a collective consciousness as in exchange for access to the anonymous memories of everyone else who has done the same. This is sort of an exact analogy with DNA information sharing. You know, if I get my DNA tested and I make my results available, if I want to find out if I have relatives, people can also find me. And what I learned that was kind of fascinating is that in North America, so many people have done this, that even though I have never done it, I am totally findable just by virtue of how many people have made their results public. That was an idea that was sort of amazing to me. So anyway, that's what this is. And it has a lot of benefits. People can reinfuse complete healthy consciousness to ward off things like dementia. Criminals are caught by viewing the details of a crime through the eyes of a victim. But, as you can imagine, privacy is impaired by this device.
Which reminds me of the slogan in the novel The Circle, which is secrets are lies, sharing is caring, privacy is theft, which is a bit similar. But the question I have is, there's a famous German folk song called Die Gedanken sind frei. I tried a rough translation. Thoughts are free, who can guess them? They flee past like nighttime shadows. No one can know them. No hunter can kill it. Are thoughts free any longer if everybody has access to them? Because they're not hidden anymore. They are open. They're there for everybody. So in a way, they are contradictive to this old folk song. Thoughts are only free when nobody knows them because they're just in my head. But if what's in my head is accessible to everybody, thoughts are free no longer.
True. I mean, you know, I've had people say, oh, it feels like we're really close to a situation in which this invention could happen. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, we can't even figure out how to cure mental illness. So I don't think we understand the brain nearly enough to be replicating it on a cube. And I would go further and say, if you really think about this machine, it starts to fall apart if you look at it too closely. I mean, even the scene that I read, what does that mean? So we're looking at a film? Is that how a person sees the world? I don't think so. So this machine is, in a certain way, just a vehicle that let me write the kind of book that I wanted to write. But I will say that I think another one of those kind of ironies of the internet is that what it offers is connection. And I think as human beings, we really crave that. It's amazing what we will give up for it. You know, we'll give up all of our data just to have access to other people. And that's just one of those basic human longings. But, you know, but there's a way in which we cannot know other people or be known by other people completely. In fact, it's almost like one of those rigid facts about human life, like death, is that no one will ever know what it's like to be another person, actually. And yet we keep trying, and that effort is a lot of what you see online that looks like, you know, oversharing. It's easy to criticize, you know, overexposure. I think the impulse behind it is something that's very deep and human, which is the wish to be known and to be seen and to be understood.
Randall A. Kuhne, he's a Dutch neuroscientist and neuroengineer, director of the Department of Neuroengineering in Spain, largest private research organization in Europe. He said in a recent interview, "I'd be surprised and a bit dismayed if we wouldn't be able to upload a brain on a computer within this century."
Well, none of us knows.
None of us knows, yes.
I mean, what I would say is that the reason that feels so imminent is not because we understand the brain so well, but because the internet already functions as a kind of collective mental experience already.
Yeah.
And so it feels proximate because some version of this exists now. In other words, I can go online and in 1 hour, if I want to, I can find out an enormous amount about any particular person, including, depending on the person, musings, family photos, vacations, you never know, criminal records. So you can put together a picture pretty quickly. That's a measure of how much people have shared. That has absolutely nothing to do with our technical understanding of the human brain.
Two more questions before we have the next reading part. One is about words I think you have invented for your novel, eluders and proxies. What are they? And the other one comes later.
Okay, so as you can imagine, in a world in which many, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have shared all or part of their memories into this kind of anonymous collective, there are people who are not only don't want to participate and by sharing their own memories, but they are horrified by the degree to which they are represented in that collective. Just as I'm represented in the DNA collective of North America, so many people have so many memories of other people that anyone is findable in this collective. So there are people who are so unhappy with this state of affairs that they do something called eluding, which means they cast off their identities altogether. They give them up as the price of freedom. And there's one person who likens it to an animal chewing off its leg to escape a trap. Yeah. They take on new identities and they begin as new people, but they can't just do that suddenly and have everyone know that they've done it, because then everyone will begin looking for them. So they hire what are known as proxies to impersonate them online, so that only people who would actually expect to see them in real life will know that they're gone. And the idea is, I mean, this sounds a little dour, but it's presented pretty playfully, and I think
Yes,
that will become
absolutely.
clear when I tell you that we learned that the best proxies are fiction writers, because fiction writers are used to impersonating people. So there's a whole business of proxying, a not-for-profit, I should add. There are programs that can approximate people online, but the more expensive and nuanced proxying is done by human beings who impersonate other human beings who have shed their identities.
Great. Last question before the reading. You organized the book in terms I know from electronic dance music. Build, break, drop, build. 4 sections. Why is that?
Well, I'm always thinking about the rhythmic structure of what I'm doing. Even though I am not musical, I don't play an instrument, and I can't read music. But in A Visit from the Goon Squad, I was aware that I was using a structure that was basically a concept album, telling one big story in small parts that sound very different from each other, but work together to create a whole. I wondered in the Candy House what sort of structure could explain what I was doing here. And I came to feel that it was one in which various portals let you enter various different worlds, sort of like a Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing game where you can move through a portal into a different realm, an imaginative realm. And so then I found myself thinking, well, what is the musical equivalent of that? We're talking about one world displacing another. It's not lots of worlds working together to tell a big story so much as worlds one world dissipating and being replaced by another, and that happening again and again. And I realized that the structure of electronic dance music actually describes that kind of process.
Words taking over.
Yeah, so that you're listening to one beat, and then another one sort of infiltrates it, and then dissipates it and replaces it, and so on.
Perfect. I just feel a bit, it's a moment of déjà vu for me, because 2 days ago I was talking to David Mitchell, and he said he organized his novel as a concept album, and we were talking about Sgt. Pepper as the first concept album. If that's right, he knows I didn't.
Well, it's a musical. I mean, actually, what I will say about that, I'm not sure how old David Mitchell is, but having grown up in the 70s, which I think of as the great era of concept albums were sort of like books. You know, LPs were big, they were inside a paper sleeve, and often if it was a double album, there were actually pages of lyrics and graphics. So it was a kind of it had a literary component, that genre, and I think invites a literary comparison.
I think he was right in that. He was born 2 years after the events in his novel happened. So his novel is set in 67, 68. At the beginning, records were just something to store music on. And it was, I think, the Beatles with Sgt. Pepper who invented this, have this as a concept, not just as a storage for music.
Yeah, no, and I mean, the way we listen to music now has changed so radically. It's much more like, even if you're not listening to electronic dance music, we tend to listen to songs in a more atomized way, not listening to a story arc, because back in the days of LPs and even CDs, it was sort of a hassle to change songs. You sort of had to listen the whole way through, so there was an imposed narrative, if you will, that doesn't exist now. And I think that this book also emulates that kind of movement, that sense of digital movement that creates a narrative that often isn't actually linear.
Thank you very much. Ich würde Ihre Geduld aber gerne noch etwas strapazieren. für eine, höchstens 2 Fragen. Und Jennifer Egan bat mich, sie möchte am Ende noch ein Stückchen lesen aus der Novelle Black Box. Die ist hier in diesem Roman eingearbeitet. Eine Passage von Lulu, der Geheimagentin. Ich habe sie in meiner Einführung erwähnt. So we are not going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. We're not going to talk about the Mondrian painting hidden in Mondrian merchandise and what the meaning of Mondrian. We are not going to talk about the British TV series Black Mirror, especially about this episode San Junipero, where a brain is uploaded. We're not going to talk about Miranda Klein, all the things you can read about, I recommend it, but we are talking about the end of the book. The end is a scene which is set in a time before all these inventions take place. So it's a very conventional scene. Why is this scene at the very ending of the book? And why does the book end with the words, "You have the choice"? What choice do we have?
Well, there's never a simple answer to those questions, again. In terms of why we return to that character, we end with a character named Miles, who, it's been a little bit of a running joke through the book that he's the middle of 3 sons, and people keep forgetting that he exists. Someone will say, "Oh, you have 2 sons, right?" No, there are 3. People keep forgetting his name. He's this sort of invisible person. And one of the things that I think the book is trying to do is, in its exploration of consciousness, is to remind us that everyone has a consciousness. There are no invisible people. You know, we may be invisible to each other, we may be disregarded by each other, but that doesn't mean that every person is not an infinite cosmos of memory and perception and experience. So it felt right, now that we've established that a machine exists in this world that lets us see the most intimate thoughts of everyone, let's look at this invisible person, Miles. So we meet him on the baseball field at 11 years old.
In the 1990s.
In the 1990s. So before, there's a moment where the narrator reflects that we're sitting in a dusky sports arena and not one face is underlit by a bluish glow. How long has it been since anyone's looked out at a bunch of people and not seen a bluish glow on at least one face? So in terms of the timing, it felt great to go back to that. But of course, we don't just stay inside Miles. In that chapter, we move through all kinds of people. We see Miles at the very end of his life at a home for the elderly. And then ultimately, we return to that baseball field. And he's had an amazing hit, his one and only. And his family is celebrating because he's actually been a sort of a terrible athlete, so this is very exciting. And we've now seen the last days of Miles's life as we've moved wildly around narratively. And his father says, "So, you know, what do you feel like now?" In English, it's anything you want. Well, yes and no. We already know that we know the end of the story. We know that he won't get everything he wants. No one does. But we are returning to a moment when no one knows about any of that yet. And it's just the moment of having his life ahead of him.
Okay, so it ends, at the beginning it's a dystopia, but it ends on a very hopeful note.
You know, I don't love the word dystopia. If someone says a book is dystopian, my first thought is that's not going on my list.
Okay.
I think...
Just cross it out.
Yeah, I mean, there are many reasons. I just feel like there's been a lot of dystopian art, and for me, it honestly feels familiar. So in my quest to free myself of familiarity, I felt very eager to create to explore a world that felt full of possibility. So yes, you could say that this machine is dystopian, but it's used in all kinds of ways narratively that are hopefully kind of fun and even funny. It's true that the book is, I think, there's a lot of hope in it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I needed during the Trump presidency when I finished this book. You know, it felt too easy, I guess, to create a world without hope. That felt like the path of least resistance during the Trump years. So it was a lot more interesting and kind of energizing for me to remind myself, really, of how resilient and resourceful human beings are, and that although we are selfish, we also can work together. And this book reminded me of that. Writing this book reminded me of that.
I thought my last question would be about Biggs. Why is he carrying a copy of Ulysses with him all the time? But it's not my last question. My last question is about a wolf who huffs and puffs, you know what it means, and blows a house down. What is that? What has he to do with Lulu, the secret agent you're going to read a bit from?
Do you want me to answer the question?
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, The Wolf and a particular version of The Three Pigs by a guy named David Wiesner, who's an amazing writer and illustrator. This book, which is for sort of like not very young children, but kind of middle-aged kids, had a huge impact on me, because the way Wiesner tells the very familiar story of The Three Pigs is that the wolf blows so hard in blowing down the straw house that he blows the pig out of the book. So it's a very meta version of The Three Pigs. And the pig then, the escaped pig, it rescues his fellow pigs, and they run around in a kind of liminal space, going in and out of other storybooks that are drawn in different ways. One is in black and white, one is a cartoon, and when they enter these books, they are drawn like in the manner of the book that they've entered. And that idea seemed so thrilling to me, and I loved the idea of taking a character I had written about in a very naturalistic way, if you will, and importing that person into a stylized genre story in which I would draw her, as it were, differently. So what came out of that was a spy chapter of The Candy House, which is called Lulu the Spy 2032. And we've met Lulu before in Goon Squad, where she appears in rather small roles, naturalistically. And I'm just going to read this. This chapter was written for Twitter at 140 characters. So it exists in these tiny utterances. And I'm going to just read the first 3 sections of Lulu's accounting of her spy mission, but she narrates her mission in the form of the lessons she learns from each step she takes. Lulu the Spy, 2032. 1. People rarely look the way you expect them to, even when you've seen pictures. The first 30 seconds in a person's presence are the most important. If you're having trouble perceiving and projecting, focus on projecting. Necessary ingredients of a successful projection: giggles, bare legs, shyness. The goal is to be both irresistible and invisible. When you succeed, a certain sharpness will go out of his eyes. 2. Some powerful men actually call their beauties beauty. Counter to reputation, there is a deep camaraderie among beauties. If your designated mate is widely feared, the beauties at the house party where you've gone undercover to meet him will be especially kind. Kindness feels good, even when it's founded on a false notion of your identity and purpose. 3. Posing as a beauty means not reading what you would like to read on a rocky shore in the south of France. Sunlight on bare skin can be as nourishing as food. Even a powerful man will be briefly self-conscious when he first disrobes to his bathing suit. It is technically impossible for a man to look better in a Speedo than in swim trunks. If you love someone with dark skin, white skin looks drained of something vital.
Thank you very much. Hearing you read this, I was reminded of our talk 12 years ago. I seem to remember that you said, I love lists. And this sounds a bit like a list. Anyhow, ich habe noch etwa 42 Fragen, die ungestellt geblieben sind. Das zeigt Ihnen, wie viel es noch zu sagen gäbe. Aber ich glaube, wir ziehen einen vorläufigen Schlussstrich. Ich hoffe, es hat Ihnen gefallen. Es reizt Sie, dieses Buch zu lesen. Diese beiden Bücher, die irgendwie einen ganzen Kosmos zeigen. Ich kann es Ihnen nur empfehlen. Ich hoffe, es hat Ihnen gefallen. Danke Ihnen für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Einen schönen Abend noch. Danke.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jim.